Well, good morning. Hope you're doing well this morning. My name is Mike, and I am one of the leaders here at Risen City. It's so good to be here with you this morning. It's the privilege of mine to get to stand up here and preach to you. And if this is your first time with us today, maybe it's your first time specifically just at Risen City. Maybe you have never been to church. Maybe this is your first time in church in a long time. No matter who you are, whether you're here today and you're maybe seeking for something, searching, maybe you're a little more skeptical, maybe you don't even know why you showed up, you just happen to be here because someone promised lunch after, or whatever it is, I just want to say a special welcome to you today, truly, because you are part of the reason why we do church the way that we do it, to help people like you truly encounter the real Jesus. Because for us, God is not just some ideas, some nice novel spiritual philosophy to uphold to. No, for us, God is the God revealed in this word. We're going to talk about Him today, and He's a God to be known, a God that desires to know us, that invites us to know Him, that meets us, and as Jesus said, allows eternal life or heaven to just invade our soul and bring healing to our life and actually change us from the inside out. And that's what we're seeking today. Like if you came to church and you were thinking, I'm just going to have a nice little religious moment, check it off, God, I came to church kind of thing, that's not what we're about, because that doesn't change anyone's life. Jesus actually wants to move in and bring some health to our souls, and so that's what we're seeking. That's what we're chasing today. And one of the ways that we do that, as Christians at least, is through the Word of God. We don't believe that this Bible is just some old, antiquated book that we read for novelty's sake and because it's this spiritual book that maybe you should pick up. No, we believe that this is a good word from our good God for the good of our soul. And so we're going to open it up and submit to it and allow the author of life to sort of instruct us a little bit. Because the way that we think about it here is through the lens of an apprentice. That if we become apprentices of Jesus to learn life after His life, to learn lessons from Him, that is the place that we believe we actually get invited to know what it means to be human again, to know what it means to actually truly live, that there's some things that God has for us that if we can connect to Him, we can figure out what life was actually meant to be like. And so we are excited to be jumping into that again today. And we're going to do that in the context of a series that we started last week called 10. And it's about this pretty famous section of the Bible where, whether you're a believer or not, you've probably heard of the 10 commandments. And so we began this idea. Last week, we looked at the first commandment, which was have no other gods, and how if we sort of worship Jesus, we get freed from ourselves, freed from our selfishness, our pride, our despair, that soul level anxiety that's always chasing things that never seem to arrive, all these idols that might be in our heart or different gods. And today we're going to continue this conversation. I'm looking at commandment number 2. Commandment number 2. So if you have a Bible, if you want to open up to the book of Exodus, we are going to be back in Exodus chapter 20. And we're going to be started reading in verse 4. If you don't know much about the Bible, Exodus is the second book. It's right at the beginning. Just sort of go right to the start and flip over a few pages, and you're going to get there. Exodus 20. And this is what we read. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or anything, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, or you could say zealous God. This is the kind of affection, not like, a preteen, girl who likes this guy named Jimmy, but Sally likes Jimmy, but Jimmy likes Sally, so now I'm jealous that Sally likes Jimmy kind of thing, right? This is like when you get married. All the married people in the room, right? Do you want to share your spouse with anybody? You're jealous for your spouse. That's what this means. He's jealous for your affection. He wants you and you completely. And He's visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third or fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commands. What this is meant to do for us is to compare and contrast the weight of God's wrath versus the measure of His love. That maybe 3 or 4 generations might get some punishment, but 1,000 gets His love. Now, luckily for you and I, in the new covenant we talked about last week with Jesus dying on a cross, forgiving us our sins, all we get is the love part. We get His discipline, but no longer His punishment. All right? So this is what He says, make no images or any likeness of anything in the earth. Let's pray. Jesus, I thank you so much for your word. I thank you that you are going to meet us in it today. And hopefully, God, I pray that you will use the feeble instrument known as Mike, God, to communicate what you have for our church. I know you have a word today for these people. So I pray, God, that you would just empower me by your Spirit to use the gifts you've given me to steward, God, for your glory, for the good of this church. And pray that we will receive your message. God, if there's anything in Mike that is not of you, God, that is not for this church right now, I pray that you would just destroy it in my mind. May it not pass my lips, God, and when it does, because I am frail, God, and fragile, that you would just stop it. God, that you would just let it fall on deaf ears today. God, I pray that you would speak clearly to us, instruct us, and lead us. We thank you for it, God. We pray this in your name. Amen. Amen. So, when it comes to this thing called pets, anyone like pets? Anybody like pets, right? Like, I've thought about this for a while, and I've come to the conclusion that cats are a simpler creature than a dog. Right? Like, I'm not saying that cats are better than dogs. I understand that's a very controversial topic, right? People are cat people and dog people. They don't really understand each other, right? And those who don't want to get involved are like the fish people, right? Or I like to call them the fake pet people. Because how hard is it to have a fish? Right, like if you're killing, like I know kids kill fish all the time, but like if you're a grown adult and you're killing a fish because of neglect, you got bigger life problems than a pet thing, right? You're just faking, right? Real pets could die, legitimately make you cry about it, right? So cats and dogs, right? The reason why I think that dogs are more complicated is because they come in a lot more variety. And I don't mean breed, I mean like just personality. Because with big dogs, you can get these dogs that are more like security guard dogs that are gruff and big, but then underneath they're tender-hearted. They want to just cuddle and be all there, right? Then you got the dogs like Beethoven, right? St. Bernard, slobbery and jolly and sort of slow and whatever. Then you got the hyper little active dogs that just go and buzz all the time. Or you got the little teacup dogs, right? Which are more accessory than animal. We all know that. Like if you own a teacup, it's not because you like dogs, because you want a little accessory on your purse. That's what it is, right? And when Emily and I, right, we're looking for a dog, right, we realized, and we're not getting one, by the way, because that's a dumb decision. But when we realized that it just took a lot more, because we're like, does this dog, is it good with cat? Is it good with pets? Is it good with other pets? Is it good with children? Does it like kids? Will it bite kids? How much running space does it need? Does it have to go to walk every day? There's so many different things. Like we all know that a dog will love you and will serve you and will be there for you. But like there's a lot more to consider that doesn't come into play when you get a cat, right? Because when you get a cat, right, doesn't matter what kind of cat it is, doesn't matter what it looks like, it's the same thing. You know how this is going to go. You serve it. That's it. Right? When you get a cat, right, you gain a master. That's how this relationship happens. It might be an orange cat. It might be a tabby cat. It doesn't matter, right? You serve it from now on. You don't get to set the terms of this relationship. Like when I was growing up, we had a cat, pretty stereotypical, named Sophie. And she, right, if she wanted affection, she'd come up and rub against your leg. But the moment you went like a millimeter too far or like a second too long, you lost your hand. Scratching, hissing, biting, that's just how it went. If she wanted us to cuddle her, she would come up and be all cute and purr and get our affection. But if we wanted to cuddle her, no, that did not happen, right? It was just living life in servitude of an animal, right? And then they die, and we still cry about it. But like in my mind, I'm like, we're free now, right? This is a good day. Like they're part of the family. But here's the thing: when it comes to a cat, right? They set all the terms of this, right? You don't get to do any of that, right? They tell you how it's going to go, and you just sort of enter into this relationship, and you serve them for a while. And to a much greater and gracious degree, I find this is actually how God operates, right? And what I mean is this: He sets the terms of our engagement. We don't get to come to God and say, well, here's how I want you to be, and here's what I hope that you are, and here's how we're going to interact. No, God sort of walks in and says, hey, here's who I am, here's how this is going to go. And we need to begin to play off Him in that way. And the problem is when we don't do that, we actually end up losing a little bit of ourselves. And so the invitation today is pretty awesome, that when we can come to God and let Him set the terms of engagement, set the terms of this relationship, define Him as He actually is, what happens for you and I is we get invited actually to a greater level of health in our soul. It's pretty incredible. So I want to dive into that today, because last week, if you were here, right, we started the command of have no other gods. That, as I said earlier, that if we worship the one true God, Jesus, then we get freed up from our anxieties, from our fears, from our despair, our pride, our sort of self-focused life. But here's the problem, right? Just knowing that I should be worshiping Jesus and actually worshiping the real Jesus are very different things, right? And so today we have to have this sort of light Sunday morning conversation all about who actually God is, right? Easy stuff to think about, but we have to go there today because the first four, if you remember, of commandments are all about God, all about how we relate to Him, ultimately how we sort of come in relationship with Him. And so we got to dig into this commandment today where God says, make no idols, form no images, don't build any little statues. Now, you might be thinking, Mike, I'm not tempted to do that. I'm not tempted to build a little statue and act all primitive like those ancient people, believing I can carry my God in my pocket or anything like that. Because credit cards and cell phones don't sound anything at all like that. But whatever, right? This is really what we would call an instance of chronological snobbery, as C.S. Lewis called it. This idea that because we are further on in time, as we look back on people who did things differently, maybe less sophisticated in some ways, who thought different things, that somehow we are fundamentally better. That our cultural moment is more superior, is greater, is more awesome, and we sort of look back and judge them. But we have to remember, right? We shouldn't be so prideful, because in a couple years from now, our grandkids, right, will be looking back at us and thinking that we're crazy. Right? Like I do that to my grandparents sometimes, right? Like my grandparents' generation, right? They weren't allowed to go to the theater, right? Because apparently Jesus can't go into movies. Like he just can't find you there, right? Or they wouldn't play with cards. Or my grandmother, she didn't get her ears pierced till she was like 50, right? And we would look at that and say, that was just ridiculous. Like, why does that even matter? But in a couple years from now, they'll look back at our time, our millennial little people with our Quasimodo hunchbacks because of our phone, and think you guys were crazy. Right? Looking into our culture thinking, hey, right, you care more about eagle eggs than them babies. And think that somehow we have arrived is just ridiculous. And so let's not be so arrogant to think that our current moment is the best one to live in. Because I want you to understand this. I recognize the fact that you might not go home today and find a silversmith and build a little idol to hold in your room. But whether you know that or not, 80% of the world basically still struggles with this. Right? Religions all over the place, building idols to their God. And although, hear me today, you might not actually go and build a statue, you are always constructing an idol. Don't get it twisted. Right? You are building this image of God that's actually not him, to put in a place that seems like I can capture who God is in and what I want him to be. And so what we have to understand today is that when we come to this commandment, it might seem culturally distant, but actually it's quite powerful because it has impacted, in fact, Christian history for about 2,000 years. There have been many arguments about whether this means we can have paintings in church and draw images of Jesus, which I know probably for most of us today is not really an applicable conversation, right? That might be more for a bunch of like hipster artists drinking their macchiatos at show and tell or something like that. Then for Sunday morning, I get that. But what this does matter is this. I want you to hear this. That when Jesus shows up and he says, hey, no idols, no images, what he's saying to you today is you don't get to define who I am. I will show you that. I want to invite you to see me as I am so that you can hear me, begin to see yourself as you are and find some healing and strength in those moments. So we have to sort of come on this journey because there's something incredible here about this command that shows us about the nature of God, that doesn't let us get off the hook. God's staying before us saying, hey, I want to invite you into this moment where you can begin to recognize actually who I am, and in that place find some freedom that you've been searching for. Right? Because remember what we said last week, right? That this is God setting his people free and now training them or teaching them how to ultimately live free, which we see as the kingdom of heaven that Jesus talked about. Coming into earth, coming into soul, and setting us to be like him. So the first thing that this sort of commandment does is we have to understand the context upon which it was given, right? Because this was spoken into a world where everyone literally did have idols. Every local city, every region had gods and idols. Every temple that existed that was religious had at the center of it an image to go and bow down and see. There was this fundamental thought that the gods that existed, which last week God already said actually don't exist, but that's a whole other conversation, right? That these gods could be captured, could be seen, could take on human form, or as we talked about last week, Abraham, his daddy who worshiped the moon, to be sort of described in these created ways. And they could be tangible, they could be captured, they could be made into this image. And into this culture, God shows up. Yahweh says, hey, I am the God unlike any other God you've ever known. I am so different. I'm so far above, transcendent, and great. I'm uncapturable. I'm unimageable. I'm unformable. You can't make me fit a little box that your mind understands. And although we might, because I think of time and maybe some cultural distance, not recognize the incredible nature of what God's doing here, he is literally reshaping their vision of what God actually is. I'm unlike any other God you've ever considered. I'm beyond your mind's grasp. I'm beyond your capacity to understand. I am bigger and greater and more than you think that I am. And when he invites us into this place, this is crazy. When he begins to say, hey, come and see me, what this does for you and I, as we are tempted to sort of push him away and reduce him, is it actually invites us to see us as we are. Why? Because when we begin to see him in his greatness and actually who he is and not try to tame him and box him in, we begin to recognize our innate smallness. Our littleness, our unworthiness, but yet somehow this God moves in and displays us and invites us the transcendent beyond God, becoming imminent and close and saying, hey, you can actually know me. You can enter into this relationship with me. I'm going to tell you about myself. And here's the thing. This is why it matters, because whether or not you think this or not, right, you cannot actually define yourself without referencing something external in a relationship. Right? You don't get to be the little blonde girl on YouTube, right? Looking at herself in the mirror, telling herself that she's awesome and wonderful and I can do it. Because hear me, if you're 25 still having to convince yourself that you're awesome and you're wonderful and you can do it, listen, you are deluded. Because number one, you probably aren't that awesome. Can we just be real, right? You're not that great all the time. Right? And plus, right, if you are still struggling to figure out who you are, maybe there's a deeper level of an issue here. But here's the problem. When we come to God, he begins to say, hey, I will be the external reference for you. I will begin to tell you who you are. I will show you who I am so you can recognize who you were made to be. There's always this kind of external voice that we live under. And when God shows up and says, here, this is me, we get access to what we actually are. It's an invitation of God, not just something to see him, but actually to begin to see yourself. But this is the problem. We don't like seeing God as he is. We don't want to see God as he is. We try to make God fit our little rational boxes and our understanding and our preferences as if that is the limitations of who God actually is. And the problem with that is you have to understand that when you do that temptation to reduce God, that sin of reducing God, all it does is actually inflate your own ego and reduce the health of your soul. This is the problem, right? We are tempted to believe that my mind, my moment, my preference, my understanding, my reason is the limitation by which God must exist in, or else I have to reject him, which is ridiculous because God, by definition, should be bigger than your mind's eye can see. Should be greater in all things, in his goodness, in his mercy, in his holiness, than what your mind can actually articulate and put in its place. But this is the temptation for the modern world for us. When we look to this kind of law, it's this: do not reduce me. Do not make me capturable. Do not try to form me in your own image and make me fit your mind's eye. Let me be God so you can actually go and be you. Now, what this law does for us, it actually does make some very specific things true about God. Right? Number one, he's unlike all other things. But then number two is he makes himself very distinct from creation itself. Because he said, right, that you cannot form me in anything, right, that looks like something in heaven above or the stars and the moon, the planets, or on earth or in the water. Nothing that I have made can be used as an image to capture who I am. That I am distinct, above, transcendent, far greater than what I made. That creation and creator are different. Now, the reason why we have to understand that this is important is because there are those theologies, even in the church today, that sort of begin to sound real nice, sound real spiritual, but essentially say this, that God is everything. God is in everything. God is the divine energy that zisms and moves and empowers and is there, and all of us, the trees are God, and the chair is God, and hey, even you're part of the divine consciousness. You have the divine spark. You are divinity waiting to be revealed. And hear me today. I know it sounds good. It scratches my ego. I would not want to be told that they are God. Here's the truth, though. You're not. And it's important to recognize this. Because if you begin to believe that God is in everything, and God is everything, he's moving, and we're all just connected, part of this thing, what does this do for you? It leaves you with nothing at all. Because then God is no longer the transcendent, separate, distant Savior, personal, aware, judging God who holds justice before us, and we have nothing to cry out to, no one to hope, and hear me today, nothing to complain about. Why? Because the good that happens to me is just as God as the evil. That the abused and the abuser are just as God if he is in everything. That you don't get to stand there and complain about suffering or about evil because the God of the universe is in Hitler like he's in you. No difference. That's not livable. No one actually believes that. But yet we talk about it like modern spirituality. This is all we are. You don't get to differentiate between the ones who actually have God and the ones that don't. Either we all are in God or we all are not God. We don't live in this world. We get to selectively choose who gets part of that. Right? The truth is so much better than the lie of modern spirituality. It's so much greater because what does it leave for me? That someone is aware of my issue. Justice will never be left unmet. And I actually can cry out to someone who's aware of what's going on. It's so much better than the belief that somehow I am God. Like if you look in the mirror today and you get afraid, it's not because you're looking into the face of God. There might be some other issues why you're afraid, but that's between you and your workout plan, right? This is the thing, right? We have to understand, right? You're not God. What offends you is not offending the divine. And by the way, to be married to that person is horrible. Just think about that for a second. Right? Married to someone who believes that they're God, that God's in all of this stuff, they can never be wrong. How is God wrong? If God's in that, then that means parts of God are quite selfish and greedy and lustful and prideful and evil. It just doesn't make any sense. Right? God said, no, I am separate, I am different, I am greater than what I have made. I'm not in this, I am separate. Now, as a Christian, what do we believe? Right? That God empowers us by His Spirit, but that we are not Him. Right? This personal being known as God comes and strengthens our soul to be like Him and pursue Him. But there's a clear distinction between what He is and who we are. We are not in that. We're not even close to that. Right? And so we reject this kind of monist understanding of the universe that all is one. Pantheism, panentheism, paganism, all these different ideas about God. We say, actually, no, that's not how this operates. God is different, separate, and greater than what we are. But then you might be thinking, well, Mike, I don't really struggle with this whole sort of modern spirituality thing. I'm a much more rational person than that. You know, I have my ideas about God, and as sort of culture goes, that says the only rational way to sort of view and interact God is to actually view Him as not there at all. That the only way to define God is the one that doesn't actually exist. And here's the thing, right? This command comes up against this idea of kind of a secular atheism as well, because God already said, hey, I'm here, and this is who I am. So you can't just posit that and then deny it all. Now, I want to get into this just for a moment, because we have to understand this today, right? There's this idea in culture that says that the only way to truly understand God, the only rational way to approach God is to conclude He is not there, right? And we would say, actually, that's false. There's nothing that holds up God and rationality as somehow polar opposite. In fact, for the last 2,000 years of human history, some of the greatest minds, most rational and smart people have been captured by the beauty of God. The issue actually isn't logic or reason. It's that there's this worldview beneath it. Right? Because I want you to understand this. Atheism as well as Christianity are both common in this. They are based on some faith propositions that we can't actually verify by evidence. Right? How many of you guys have ever died and come back? Right? So when you say, to someone, they must not be suffering now that they died. How do you know that? You don't know that. You're assuming a metaphysical reality based on your assumptions in this one. Have you ever been to the beginning of the universe? No. Right? So we make some assumptions about how this all began, because every worldview has to answer some questions. Where did we start? Where are we going? What are issues? How do we solve the problems? Where do we go when we die? What's the meaning of life? All these fundamental questions. And by the way, every single worldview, doesn't matter what it is, makes the same basic faith assumptions on things they can't actually prove. But we believe by revelation we have seen. Because for the Christian, we don't argue today that we have every single answer that is there. All we argue is that we have the best answer, the most coherent one, the one that lines up mostly with how humans actually live in the pursuit of freedom and love and beauty and meaning. Because, by the way, if you take the line of the atheist, none of those things matter. Nothing. Right? And we have to begin to understand this here today, that just because someone comes into the room and says, hey, I don't believe in God, so you better prove to me that He exists, right? They're on the hook for as much burden of proof as you are. Christians sometimes sort of just cave into this idea that it's we who have to defend that God is there. Hear me today. Any single kind of truth claim, no matter what it is, whether it's affirmative or negative, has to be backed up with some kind of burden of proof. And so as Christians, we can look back at the atheist and say, well, prove that He doesn't exist. Because I can come with at least 12 different proofs that He actually does. What do you got? Right? And so we have to be a little more confident in this and realize that, hey, God has shown himself, and that no, not the only rational way to understand God is to be in his denial, right? Because we have to see here today that even that, atheism by itself, is actually untenable. Most atheists aren't true, honest in their atheism, because brought to its own conclusion, what does it leave you with? You are nothing, you go to nothing, you came from nothing, you mean nothing, love is nothing, purpose is nothing, morality is nothing, justice is nothing, all just cultural preference and moments. So you can't complain about your suffering, don't complain about your oppressor, because the strong should overtake the weak. That's where this goes. And no one lives like that. No one does. So maybe the things that we hold deepest as human beings that make the most sense because God made a reasoned and rational and purposeful world, maybe that leads us somewhere. But again, I would argue this, that most people, most common sort of average people, aren't actually hardened, sort of committed atheists. What they are sort of just confused spiritual people. Because I've talked to a lot of people who say, well, I just reject God. I don't believe in him. But if you go ask them, which God do you reject? Describe him for me, right? Christians end up rejecting the same God they do, right? Because I don't know if you know this, but Christians reject almost every single other God that's posited except for one. Right? And you ask them, so describe this God to me, and you always get some caricature of God. Right? There's this sort of mean, distant, aloof, white, bearded guy up in the sky who's trigger happy, waiting to smite me and take me down and kill joy and hate everybody and just is there to just sort of police my behavior, be my therapist whenever I need her, give me some nice stuff. But listen to me, we reject that God. That's not the God that we sing about. So if that's the God you've rejected and thought that that's who we put away as Christians, listen to me, that's not who we worship. Who do we worship? We worship the God seen in Jesus. Now this is where everything just shifts. Okay, I want you to come along with this. Because we just said for the last 25 minutes that God said you cannot make a form out of me. I cannot be captured. But then Colossians 1 says, hey, Jesus is the image of the invisible God. That God, when he rolls up on the scene in Bethlehem 4 BC, Jesus shows up, God takes a form. God breaks his own commandment. God shows up and says, this is what I look like. This is what I am like. As John says, that we saw the glory of God dwell in Jesus. That when you and I think of God, hear me today, we only are to be thinking of Jesus. This is why he was murdered. I don't know if you know this, right? Because the Jews recognized that Jesus claimed to be the God of the universe who's going to tear down the temple, be put in the grave, and rise up out of it. Then he went and did that. The point of what Jesus says is, hey, if you want to know God at all in any kind of definition, if it does not get filtered through the lens of Jesus, then you're denying or affirming a God that doesn't actually exist. For us, what we claim, the exclusive claim, maybe the confrontational and controversial claim of following Jesus is that the only way to know who God is and what God is like is to look at the life of Jesus. And if your version of God does not line up with his life, then you don't worship God. That he's not like anything else. He is Jesus. That's why this is so important for us, because we have to understand that when we come to him, we have to come as he is, as the God revealed by the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. That is it. That's what we worship. That's where we go. Nothing else. He is the image of the invisible God. I don't get to make him anything else. I don't get to tell him what it's going to be. This is who you are, the image of the invisible God, Jesus. Now, Christians, we sort of get tripped up here because we get to his name right, because we know what to call him. But it doesn't always mean we actually worship who he actually is. See, because I've found that as Christians, the way that we often break this commandment is by trying to reduce God to somehow fit within my personal and my desired lifestyle, theological framework, and make Jesus somehow conveniently always agree with and fit in my little box. As if what I choose and what I want is what exactly he tends to be. That somehow God always matches my theological bent, my little bit. Right? That when Jesus comes in and we begin to think somehow that I can make God whatever I want him to be. If I just call him Jesus, and see, we do this all the time. Right? We do this with theological things. But I want you to know, God is way bigger than your little minds, Christians. Right? And I'm speaking to myself too, right? But the way that this often gets put out in culture right now is in the political world. Right? That Jesus, he's the Jesus who would be on the liberal side. Or he's the Jesus of the conservatives, the Jesus of the Republicans and the Democrats in the states. And we begin to tack on Jesus with our political theories and think that's totally what God would want. Hear me today. Don't be so sinful in your reduction of God to put your party on his name. Because hear me today, he is so much bigger than that. Right? You can have your political theories. In fact, you should. I hope you are engaging with society and thinking, how do we build a greater city and greater nation? You should. But hear me today. When you go to debate, don't assume he sits on your side of the aisle, because he probably doesn't. In fact, if he was here today, he'd probably be ticking off both sides. Because he's the same Jesus who walked up and paid Caesar and then said, give to the poor. The same guy who did a whole sermon calling the religious traditionalists whitewashed tombs. And then looks at the prostitutes and says, hey, knock it off. He's a Jesus who doesn't let us box him into our little ideological space and think that that is exactly who. If you are a political person, right, and the only reason why you do what you do politically is because you think that's what Jesus wants, you need to think deeper for a little bit. Right? You have some ideas how to express the values of Christianity through the political system, fine. Do that. But don't assume that yours is the God-touched one. Because all that does is make him look dumb. And I would rather not try to do that to him. I'd rather stand a little bit in humility and say, God, here's how I think this is going to go. Here's my best guess. So can we just walk hand in hand as Christians? Like, if you want to be a good Christian political person, here's what you do, right? You get involved. You seek justice. You pray for your leaders, whether you like them or not. You seek the good and flourishing of the city like God commanded his people to do. And then you debate in the church whether it's one way or the other. And then you hug at the end. Buy each other tea and say, cheerio. I don't know. Thanks, Sam. It's good advice. I need to breathe. I'm talking fast. Whew! Welcome to Risen City. My name is Mike. We get this every week. Anyways, where was I? Oh, politics. Yes. And also, right, our little sort of liberal theories on things or progressive social things, because even if you're not a Christian, you still do this, right? People will say, well, I like Jesus, I just don't like Christians. Listen to me, right? Jesus is so much bigger than whether you're progressive or whether you're fundamentalist, because hear me, if Jesus was alive today, I'm pretty sure he'd be ticking off the most Southern Baptist kind of people and the most progressive liberals, right? Because I don't know if you knew this, if you actually read through the words of Jesus, right, in the same sermon, he's saying feed the poor, he's also saying everything about hell. Ticking everybody off, right? And that's how he's supposed to be. Why? Because he's bigger than your little mind can understand. He's greater than our box. If God doesn't confront us, he's not actually God, because we have tamed him. God, we should expect him to come and sort of rub up against us and begin to shape us, inform us, and tell us. That's not how that's supposed to go. We should not buy in to the reduction of God. It dishonors who he is and sets us up to do some pretty dumb cultural things. And lastly today, and actually Ivan or Ben, you guys can come up. I want to end with this thought, is the way that Christians often do this most, on a more personal level with maybe your marriage, your family, is we like to reduce the holiness of God by believing he doesn't really care about that sin in my life. Or we'll say things, kind of like husbands, right? Like husbands, right? Go with me for a second, right? When you do something dumb, right? And you know your wife's not going to like it, right? Sometimes we will play this drama in our head that, no, she won't really care. I know it wasn't that, but no, she'll get over it. She doesn't care about that thing. I know it's the 100th time I've done it, but this time I have a good excuse, right? We'll play this game. You ever done that before, right? Am I the only guy who's ever done that? Because if that's so, then I got some issues. I know I do, but beside the point, right? We do that with God all the time, right? He doesn't care about this sin in my life because I went to church on Sunday. He doesn't care that I'm greedy and selfish. I helped the old lady across the road. Why does God care about my porn issue? There are bigger things to concern himself about. Why would God care that I'm sleeping with my girlfriend? I came to church and worshiped and my hands were in the air, right? After my hands were being all over her. But hey, why does God care about that? Or I'm a jerk at work. I neglect my kids. I don't pay my employees. I hurt my spouse. But why would God care about those things when I got these other? Listen to me. God cares about it. I want you to hear this thing. Because he loves you. The moment you try to reduce his holiness, you actually reduce his purpose for your life, you reduce his love for your life, and you reduce what he's actually chasing in your life. Why? Because God's goal, we've talked about it many times here at Risen, is not for your begrudging, joyless submission, but his kingdom alive in your life, the joy and the flourishing of your soul. So you better let this God come in and confront some things in you, because you don't have it figured out, and you're a little bit messed up. But praise be to God that Jesus sees us. Here's the thing. Here's the best news you're going to hear all day, right now. Guaranteed, right? Second would be that my kids want a nap. Parents, can I get an amen, right? Is this. You're not God. You don't get to tell him who he is. You don't get to come before him and set the terms. That's not how this works. We come before him, and when we do, what happens? Our humility and reverence increases. I get destabilized. See, this is the power of this. When I get to stand before God and actually see him as he is, as the Jesus, full of grace and truth, love and justice, confronting holiness, but just never-ending mercy, I stand before him and I begin to realize, wow, I'm pretty small. I don't have all this stuff worked out. But yet this God will look at me and deem me worthy to die for, worthy to pursue in love. Like I want you to think about this for a moment. When I stand before the greatness of my God and see him as he is, what begins to happen is I get decentralized and I get destabilized and I get pushed out of my own little God-worshiping moment of me, because that's the fundamental issue. I want God to match my wants and my needs and fit my mind and my reason and the way that I do my life, because I want it all to be. But listen, when you actually see God as he is, you get small, you get little, your limitations get big, your weakness grows, and his strength can fill. This is the place of true healing. Why? Because you get actually exposed. Your mask begins to melt before this God, right? And you get to see who you actually are, not who you pretend to be, because we all know we have that. The guy you try to put on there when everyone's around, the actual you gets exposed before God. It begins to melt away. The warts, the issues, the pain, the bad, the wounds, the not so Instagram-worthy life that you know you have is seen. But hear me, when that happens, healing does. Why? Because God won't heal what you hide. God won't deal with what you pretend not to have. But when we stand before him and we begin to allow his glory, his weight to just begin to melt our souls down and see us as we are, I don't have to be strong anymore because he is. I don't got to have the little perfect marriage and put it on because I know there is a gracious Redeemer who helps me in it. I don't got to be strong. But if I don't see him as he is, then I believe I have to do it myself. I got to carry this all by me. I got to figure it out. But I see that his greatness is so much better than what I understand. His love is so much deeper than I understand. His holiness is so much grander. His greatness is beyond. Then I begin to realize, hey, this God holds the world, and I'm in his palm. This guy sees what's going on, and I can trust him. His goodness is better than I understand, and all good things come from the Father of lights that is above. I begin to recognize that when I'm sinful, his grace is greater. When I'm in pain, his justice is full. I begin to recognize I'm not holding this up. And what happens is life begins to make more sense because I'm no longer in the middle of it. Your marriage makes more sense. Your parenting makes more sense. Your job makes more, your purpose makes more sense when you find yourself not at the center of it all. Because when you don't have an idol, you find your humility. When you don't have an idol, the Spirit of God can move in and actually begin to heal. When I don't reduce the King of the universe to what I want him to be, but see him as he is, it's so much better than what I thought. See, this is the gospel. This is the grace of God. That in my weakness, in my limitations, in my smallness, in my littleness, the great God of the universe came and died for me, pulled me up, took me, wanted me. Not when I did the 10 commandments, not when I followed all the rules, not when I balanced out karma and made the scales all match. No, when I just came and said, God, I see you, I need you, I'm weak, I'm nothing, your grace is good. That's when our life changes. That's the good news that we Christians praise about. Not that I'm wonderful, but that he is. Not that I have it all together, but that he's bringing bringing me to that point. Not that I'm strong, but that he's strong. That's the whole point of this whole thing called Jesus, is that the God unseeable became seen in him, the God who would die for us. And when I recognize that, what happens? I can now go and be like him. Because if God could do that, he can make me do that too. If you're here today and you currently don't follow Jesus, I want you to know God does want your freedom. God does want your life, but you won't find that unless you come and actually see him as he is. Today's an invitation to find out that, hey, you don't have to be strong anymore. You don't have to pretend to not care and be aloof. You can find your healing in him. A God who speaks a better word than your dad ever did. A God who speaks a greater word than that teacher ever did. A God who doesn't reject you, who knows you and sees you, but yet died for you, the actual you, to make you what he actually wants you to be, a son, a daughter of the King, free of shame, free of guilt, set free in life. This is the invitation. But here's the thing. No one can make you get it. No one can force your hand. You would come and receive life today from him. Follow Jesus, apprentice life after him. This is the path you start. See him as he is. And life begins to change. Christians, you are reducing him. The question is how and why. I challenge you to see him as he actually is. Because that will be your place of freedom too. Would you stand? I want to pray for us today.